मैं ब्राजील के राष्ट्रपति लूला डी सिल्वा को प्रेसिडेंसी का गेवल सौंपता हूं।
Brothers and sisters from India, dear, thank you very much.
मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि हम नवंबर के अंत में G20 का एक वर्चुअल सेशन और रखें।
We need to redouble our efforts to achieve the goal of ending world hunger by 2030.
We were able to agree on the G20 Leaders' Declaration, which is a truly meaningful achievement.
This G20 confirms once again the isolation of Russia.
Russia is, and Putin is, very much in the wrong in terms of the instability they're causing in the world, the impact on food prices, the impact on global inflation, on supply chains.
Hello and welcome to our special broadcast, the G20 special. This is really the end of India's G20 presidency. We're reporting live from the Bharat Mandapam, the International Media Center here in ITPO building. We're actually now waiting for the Prime Minister. Yes, this is going to be a visit by the Prime Minister to the Media Center. All the preparations, all the security arrangements are in place. We believe he's in hall number 14 right now. He would be first visiting the country pavilion before he comes here to the media center. So let's see whether he speaks to the media or just takes a round of the media center and leaves. But before we go to that, let's focus on the big developments. Let's wrap what's happened over the last 2 to 3 days. Hectic discussions leading up to the G20 Summit, and discussions really went on till the last minute when it comes to the declaration. Yes, India has managed consensus on the communique. We have seen Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa, saying there was 100% consensus on all 83 paragraphs in the declaration. You can see the Prime Minister on air. He was thumping the table, cheering everyone and saying that yes, the G20 Delhi Declaration is done. Now, while Russia was only mentioned once, and there was a dilution of the Bali Declaration as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, everyone was on board with the G20 declaration, and the Indian government said that it was really Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, countries like these, countries which are emerging economies, which helped India achieve consensus. The declaration also highlights crucial agreements on cryptocurrency regulations, multilateral bank reforms, among others. The other big takeaway, a big infrastructure deal, the IMEC corridor, or the India, Middle East, Europe corridor was launched, and this is a new economic corridor. According to sources in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this really opens up a whole new commercial opportunity across different sectors for Indian businesses and the government as well. This is going to be a major rail and shipping project aimed at fostering economic growth and also rivaling China's One Belt and Road initiative as well. The other big takeaway, the 55-member African Union was made a permanent member of the G20, and this is significant because India had been pushing for this. Remember, many Indian businesses have significant interests in Africa. India has now handed over the G20 presidency to Brazil, and the next G20 summit will be held in Rio de Janeiro. So a very important summit for the Indian government, and officials saying that there was consensus on all counts, and the consensus had been building up over the last few weeks, and probably the Prime Minister's visit to South Africa for the BRICS summit and Jakarta as recently as the 7th of September for the ASEAN summit were the clincher. In fact, many back-channel conversations have contributed to putting the summit on track and putting the consensus document on track. This was important for the Indian government, the image and all the branding that had gone into G20, because for the last 1 year, they had really taken the G20 message in an extravagant manner to all across the country. I'd like to get in my colleagues Sapna Das and Shivani Bazaz at this stage. Before we go across to our guests, we would be joined by Jacob Kirkegaard of Peterson Institute of Economic Affairs. We also have with us Mukesh Aghi of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, and we will also be joined by Ashok Kantha, veteran diplomat and former Indian ambassador to China. Let's first talk about the economic deliverables, and there were quite a few. Remember, G20 is primarily an economic forum. We are talking about issues such as debt restructuring, about climate financing, about multilateral development bank reform, cryptocurrencies as well. My colleague Sapna Das, who tracks the finance ministry very, very closely, and she has been speaking to the Department of Economic Affairs, the CEA, and a whole host of finance ministry officials through the day. It's been a hectic time for the finance track, the finance minister and her team. The issues that we had with China, the differences that we had with them on climate financing, on debt restructuring, to what extent have they been addressed, Sapna, or do they remain unaddressed?
Well, I think on the debt restructuring part, the climate resilience clause of the debt restructuring, there hasn't been any kind of consensus on that. So I do not think it has been mentioned in the declaration outcome as such. I think what was thought about was that a number of countries have felt that more technical work is needed. So there are issues around different parts of debt treatment. I think that's where we leave it. However, what has happened is on India's initiative, you do have a global sovereign debt roundtable, the GSDR, which is very important. So at this point in time, India was the co-chair in the sense that you have IMF and World Bank doing it, and then you have the main country doing the G20 as the co-chair. So this year it was India. Now next year onwards it will be some other country to whom we are handing over the baton.
Right.
So what happens in that is that you end up as a creditor, and all creditors have to have a uniform treatment. So from next year onwards, India will be one of the creditors because we have given, I think, external loans over $8 billion to the distressed nations.
Right.
So this is one aspect we need to keep in mind. The climate resilience part of the debt treatment has gone unresolved as of now.
And also the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, whether it is debt restructuring, on how the capital, on how the debt restructuring common framework, and also the FSB regulations and recommendations in cryptocurrencies are adopted, how they are implemented globally. All of that will have to be seen. This will be a work in progress. We'll have to see how much can actually be delivered, Sapna.
Yeah, absolutely. But just coming back on the debt part slightly, so on the common framework, I think the India presidency has done a very good job. As the finance minister was mentioning yesterday, that after, since 2021, it was only Chad which had got this done. But within that, I think we have been quite successful. And we also got the Sri Lanka debt restructuring done, even outside the common framework. So we have pushed for a more strong and a more time-bound common framework as far as debt restructuring is concerned. That is all right, but the climate resilience part is the thing that has not really gone ahead. So that's one. Second, also in terms of cryptocurrency, again, as we have been talking earlier, that it was India's initiative that was brought onto the G20 agenda. And here there is, it seems as if common regulation is what it's going to be. Yes, but you're right. It will depend on, how the central bank governors and the finance ministers view that roadmap, which is in place. And we'll have to wait and watch and see what regulations India adopts for its own part.
Yes, the Financial Stability Board is now working with the IMF to build capacity in all countries to regulate crypto assets and stablecoins. Shivani, to get you in very quickly, a lot of surprises since yesterday. We didn't know about the press conference. It was being denied by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All of a sudden, that happened. Today, the Prime Minister is going to come. Why do you think the PM is coming here? What really is the plan?
So, Parikshit, as we know, it was a successful G20 summit as far as, the consensus, which was unlikely, seemed like it is unlikely, but it was how the declaration was consented by all the G20 members. And I think Prime Minister's visit to IMC is also sort of a thank you for international media and as well as national media. And maybe we don't know if he's going to speak to the international media or the national media, in fact. But it's a sort of, summit. It's a sort of finale to this entire coverage that we have seen in the last 2 days. It was extensive, of course, since 7 in the morning to 9 in the evening and 9 in the night. Everybody was covering. So I think that is one of the goals of Prime Minister coming here. And we also hear that maybe he had plans of visiting the Crafts Pavilion, where a lot of artisans from across the country were there. They were displaying their art and crafts in the last 2 days. So that will be a good thing. We are also getting to understand that maybe there is a high tea that is being planned for Prime Minister, and that is, of course, being done by ITC. So all in all, as you said, there were a lot of deliverables on the table, all done, and let's see how it pans out from here. But I think Prime Minister's coming here to IMC is also to look at what kind of arrangements were made for international media as well as national media. So that's good. That's great.
So lots of security here, Shivani. The final round of security checks happening, and I believe anytime the next 15 to 20 minutes, the Prime Minister should arrive. But let me open this up to our guests who've been waiting patiently. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me begin with Mukesh Aghi. Mukesh Aghi, how do you view India's presidency, the role that we have played in this G20 meeting, the big takeaways according to you?
Well, congratulations. This is a crowning moment for India to get a consensus in a very fractured world. More important is we were able to get African Union as part of G20. Now it will be called G21. That gives access to Indian companies a much stronger access. The IMEC is a success story. It basically kind of counters BRI, but much more partnership between European technology, Saudi money, and India's manpower to build the infrastructure. On the Biofuel Alliance, tremendous success story. But more important is, I think, focusing on building a consensus. We didn't expect basically a communique coming out, which was agreed by all, but India was able to deliver on that. So I would say congratulations and enjoy the moment.
Right. Congratulations to India. Enjoy the moment. That's what Mukesh Aghi is saying. Let me get in Ambassador Ashok Kantha. Ambassador Kantha, we know about Russia's views on the Ukraine war, on the communique, and China's views as well. How do you think these countries came around, and how do you think India managed to convince them and the G7?
I believe, Parikshit, it's a victory for India's diplomacy as well as flexibility shown by various member countries. China and Russia, they were not prepared to go along with the Bali template, which involved fairly explicit criticism of Russia. So this time we had to find a new formulation, which involved our friends from the West, the USA, G7 countries, EU, showing fair amount of flexibility. So we have the ideas of Bali template included, including references to UN Security Council, UNGA resolutions without spelling them out, as also the reiteration of principle of non-acquisition of territory by force, respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty, respect for political independence, and suffering of the people of Ukraine. All those elements are there, but in a language that is acceptable to China and Russia. So we could play the role of bridge across divides in a very fractured world, and we did that successfully. The important thing is that not only we have a consensus document on all 83 paragraphs, but it was arrived at right at the beginning of the summit, on day one of the summit. And apart from paragraphs relating to Ukraine, we have a whole lot of very concrete deliverables. Mukesh referred to induction of African Union as a member of G20. I believe this will redress the imbalance in the composition of G20, because so far a continent of 1.3 billion people had only one representative, South Africa. It will also give a push to our whole agenda of articulating sentiments, aspirations, and interests of Global South. Apart from that, there are a whole lot of other openings. They need to be followed up. There are also important initiatives outside the framework of G20. Mukesh referred to India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. This is a truly momentous initiative if it is implemented properly. I think instead of comparing it with BRI, we need to learn some lessons from mistakes made by China in implementation of BRI. The way China made that China-centric project, they disregarded consideration of financial and ecological viability. All that needs to be factored in now. And it will not just be about physical infrastructure, rail cum shipping link We are also looking at interconnectivity of power grids. We are looking at hydrogen pipeline. We are looking at digital connectivity. All that will be truly, sort of in terms of geopolitical impact, it will be huge. But the real challenge is implementation. Therefore, President Biden, his remarks yesterday, he said that within 2 weeks, investors will be meeting in USA to take the idea forward. We need to flesh it out quickly and implement it with a sense of urgency in consultation with all stakeholders.
Right. Yes, you're right. The White House has put out that statement, and the last paragraph says that stakeholders from these countries are going to meet in 60 days to talk about the implementation of this project that has been agreed upon. Jacob Kirkegaard, if I were to get you in at this stage, if you look at the economic deliverables, how much have we achieved and moved ahead on the Bali Declaration when it comes to debt restructuring for the most vulnerable parts of the world, including Ghana, Ethiopia, Zambia, for that matter, for Sri Lanka?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the reality is that this is an area where perhaps spurred by the absence of Xi Jinping or the, in general, downplaying by the Chinese government of this G20, I don't think much substance was achieved, to be frank. And I think if you look at the IMF statement that came out here, it's also quite clear. Yes, there is a global roundtable, but there's no indication that China, which is the key creditor for restructuring of the country's debt that you just mentioned, is willing to move beyond what it has already declared to do in IMF-led fora, and that is, clearly not adequate to get a global consensus. I certainly believe the IMEC announcement is quite important. It's clearly a big success for the Indian government. It gives India the potential for further diversification, and obviously for a country that will not join the Belt and Road Initiative, this is an important international signal by India as well. I am, however, perhaps a little worried that, yes, as you just mentioned, the White House has announced a meeting of private investors, etc. But I think we really need to see the United States and the European Union and other participants, Saudi Arabia and others, put money on the table. Because the idea that it's enough to convene private investors and they are going to put private money at work on the basis of this declaration, I don't think will be adequate. If we want timely implementation, we will need to find sources of public money. And I don't think it's a secret that this will be quite difficult for President Biden to get the US Congress to do. But on the other hand, maybe the European Union and other Middle Eastern countries will be in a better position to take quick decisions. I lastly just want to highlight, I think, the inclusion of the tripling of G20 renewable energy commitment, I think, is a very good launch pad for the COP meeting later this year. So fundamentally, again, I think on economic deliverables, I think this was an economic success for the Indian government. But if we really want to see change on the ground, we have to have US Congress and other governments really put money on the table, and that remains to be seen.
Right. Let me take that question, especially on the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. Mukesh, Aghi, when it comes to USISPF and the industry bodies in both nations, is there interest in getting this deal off the ground? As Jacob Kirkegaard said, and also Ambassador Kantha said, we will now need to see how it is implemented. Lessons need to be learned from the mistakes that China has made with the Belt and Road Initiative. But do you feel there is significant interest? And why is it really important for the US in terms of its business interests, in terms of its foreign policy?
Well, you have to look at it from a business investment perspective. This is an opportunity for the American private sector European private sector to bring in the technology. It's an opportunity for the Saudis to have a connectivity with Europe and also with India. And it's an opportunity for India to basically counter China from a geopolitical perspective and also from a business opportunity perspective to provide the engineering services, the manpower, to build infrastructure in the Middle East connecting to Europe and India itself. You have to understand the Chinese approach on BRI was very predatory, basically laden the white elephant debt on some of these countries which cannot pay it back. Whereas here, you'll have to look at not only just from private investment perspective, but partnership with public funding also. So it has to be a balanced approach to make sure that both private and public sector would be coming in. But more importantly, you have to understand that the Persian Gulf is an area which is in constant crisis. And if the shipping lane stops, this becomes another alternative for goods to move. It may be more expensive, but I think it becomes an opportunity. So in my discussions with some of the large infrastructure companies, both in India and our members in the US itself, they're very keen to take this project forward. We will be having meetings both here with the World Bank, IMF, plus the Saudis, see what are the details we need to work and support it.
All right, we're going to take a short break, but we request all our guests, Jacob Kirkegaard, Ambassador Ashok, Kantha, and Mukesh Aghi to stay with us. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching our special coverage of the G20 Summit. This is the culmination of India's presidency. We've already handed over the presidency to Brazil. The next G20 will happen in Rio de Janeiro. Key deliverables for India across debt restructuring, cryptocurrencies, climate finance, sustainable development goals, gender gap, bridging the gender gap, and a lot more. Yes, there was a dilution of the communique, but let me discuss the role of China now with all our guests. Jacob Kirkegaard of Peterson Instt of Economic Affairs. We're also joined by Mukesh Aghi of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum and Ambassador Ashok Kantha, former Indian envoy to China. Ambassador Kantha, let me begin by asking you about China's presence here in this G20. Xi Jinping did not come. It was only just 2 to 3 days ago there was a final confirmation from the Chinese government that he would not be coming and China would be represented by the head of government, Li Qiang. China did not seek any bilateral. We've not heard of any pull aside or a handshake between Prime Minister Modi and Li Qiang or any kind of conversation during the summit. How do you think China acted and what kind of a message that China would be taking from this meeting?
Absence of President Xi Jinping was no doubt a negative signal, both for India as also for G20 as a grouping. In fact, if you look at the coverage in Chinese media of the G20 summit, it's virtually non-existent. Yesterday, People's Daily, first 2 pages, there was no reference to Li Qiang's visit to India or G20 summit. So there is a certain downgrading of importance being attached by China to G20. At the same time, I don't think absence of President Xi Jinping materially impacted outcomes of this summit. As we all agreed, outcomes have been very substantive. By and large, China went along with the consensus, though I think they were instrumental in diluting paragraphs on Ukraine along with Russia, as also on debt restructuring, where it's more aspiration rather than concrete movement, which is reflected in leaders' declaration adopted at G20 summit. On some other areas, millet, for instance, Prime Minister's Maharishi formulation that doesn't find place in leaders' declaration. We understand because Chinese were not comfortable with it. But on the whole, one can say that China didn't act as a spoiler in working out consensus at this G20 summit. They went along with the emerging sentiments that this summit must reflect concerns, interests and aspirations of the Global South, and the document plays that role very effectively. A whole lot of issues, even though details have not been worked out. You referred to climate finance. There again, I think it's more. We have referred to the need for mobilizing $5.8 to $5.9 trillion to enable developing countries to fulfill their NDCs, nationally determined commitments, another $4 billion for transition to clean energy. But how that will happen has not been spelled out. Likewise, the idea of phasing down or phasing out fossil fuels doesn't find place in joint declaration. Though I don't think China was a factor there. On the whole, I'll say that Chinese went along with other partner countries in G20, and they didn't come in the way of major deliverables being worked out at the summit.
Right. Jacob Kirkegaard, to ask you about some of the economic deliverables now, you did touch upon debt restructuring, but on the issue of two-pillar tax solution, going forward, how do you see the adoption going forward? Also on cryptocurrency framework, yes, the FSB report and recommendations have been endorsed, but how easy or complicated would it be to make sure those recommendations are adopted globally And is this easier said than done?
Well, I think the key word was just mentioned, that a lot of the financial stuff, crypto, debt restructuring is, as is the case with the G20, aspirational. And I certainly hope that the FSB will get together to come to agreement on common rules and regulation for cryptocurrencies, and hopefully also in the process build capacity for the G20 members as well as other countries for actually implementing these regulations. But I think we shouldn't pretend that this is the same as that this will be a smooth process, or that even the most advanced economies in the world, be it in Europe, the G7, and others, will actually proceed and implement consistent crypto regulations. I don't think that's the case. There is a political process going on in every individual member, virtually every individual member of the G20, certainly in India as well. And these are typically driven by domestic considerations, and they will, in my opinion, continue to trump, aspirations for globally binding or globally consistent crypto regulations. And in some ways, as I mentioned before, it's the same when it comes to the issue of debt restructuring. Again, the sticking point here is China. What degree of write-downs, principal reductions, and other things are Chinese lenders willing to accept? This is a process that will almost entirely, in my opinion, be driven by domestic considerations in China, and the risk of precedent-setting effects being potentially drawn from if the Chinese government were to accept write-downs of this nature on international commitments. Well, there's a lot of domestic debt in China that may also need to be restructured, which is a very dangerous situation domestically for domestic economic stability in China. And that is why, again, China will only move on the international debt restructuring framework when it is ready to do so domestically. And until that's the case, we can have a global roundtable, we can have a lot of G20 meetings, but I don't think anything of substance, unfortunately, will be created. Doesn't mean that the meetings like this G7, the G20 is not very important. It absolutely is. But again, on financial matters, it overwhelmingly is driven by domestic political and economic considerations. And that will prove to be the case again this time, after the Delhi Declaration.
Right. Mukesh, Aghi, speaking about the India-US engagement at this G20 and taking forward from the Prime Minister's visit to the United States just a few months back, how do you think this bilateral took the Indo-US agenda forward? There is some activity over here, and I do think the Prime Minister could be arriving soon. We will keep our cameras glued to that. But Mukesh, Aghi, you could answer that for us, the key deliverables from what the Prime Minister and President Biden had to discuss.
Well, Parikshit, let me answer the question first on China's absence. I think President Xi's presence is a loss of China leadership at the G20. That's how we see it. It gave space to Prime Minister Modi and President Biden to set up the agenda. It also showed that democratic countries, Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa got together, agreed on the communique, and then drove it to the rest of the attendees. So overall, from our perspective, we see that it was a loss for China leadership not to be present from the perspective of President Xi itself. On the bilateral, you have to understand that when Prime Minister was in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago, there were 108 different initiatives agreed upon. And these are quite critical initiatives, all the way from AI to quantum computing to space to secure supply chain. And they were a follow-up to that in the discussion in the bilateral. For example, they talked about GE engine manufacturing in India itself. They talked about deliverable of General Atomic drones to India. They talked about inclusion of women empowerment itself. So I think what we are seeing is a follow-up to 108 different joint initiatives announced by the two countries. And this process will continue. And they'll keep on checking as they keep on closing some of the initiative itself. So I think the bilateral was a success, and we need to now start seeing some of the end results, such as GE engines and others coming in, and the deliverables are being followed upon.
Okay, I'm going to just ask my camera person to start panning now, because we should show some activity over here. You can see this. This is the ground floor of the International Media Center. We've been saying how this is 30,000 square feet big. Those doors are going to open in a short while from now. This entire area has been sanitized. Multiple rounds of security checks have taken place by the SPG, by the Delhi police. So multiple layers of security. You can see these red bands. This has been done to keep the media on this side of the hall. The Prime Minister is going to walk from here straight, and he's going to take a round of the hall. And he is, whether he's going to stop for tea or not, that's something we'll have to wait and watch. But just have a look at the media contingent that has been waiting here. Around 3 o'clock, we got news that the Prime Minister is going to be arriving in the evening. A lot of the media, the international media, is here with their mics, with their phones, with their cameras to get a glimpse. Everyone is waiting to see whether the Prime Minister will speak to the press or not, or will this just be a meet and greet sort of an event? As my colleague Shivani was pointing out a short while back, this in a way is to appreciate the work done by the staff, the G20 Secretariat, the government officials involved, and maybe also interact with the media. So in a short while from now, the Prime Minister would be coming. As we discuss this and as we play these visuals, let me also ask the veteran diplomat on our panel right now, Ambassador Kantha. Ambassador Kantha, you've seen so many G20s earlier. You've seen diplomatic events. With the Prime Minister coming to the media center right now, what is the message that you read from it? This is the culmination of our G20 presidency. Officials that we've been speaking to in briefing after briefing, they are crediting the Prime Minister for showing leadership and being able to bring consensus on the table. So what do you think is the larger message with the Prime Minister coming to the International Media Center?
Parikshit, as you know, our Government of India and Prime Minister personally have attached a very high level of importance to this G20 summit. Our Prime Minister has been personally invested in it, and clearly, outcomes have been very, very impressive. And the media plays a very important role in dissemination of outcomes, the messaging coming out of the G20 summit, and many of the issues which have been discussed are deliverables agreed upon, need a whole lot of follow-up action and deliberations. So it's in a way of Prime Minister is reaching out to media, as Shivani said, to express his appreciation and also to continue this communication, this dialogue through media. Prime Minister Modi is a very effective communicator. It's part of his style, part of his agenda, the way he wishes to utilize G20 summit to showcase India's role, and also to showcase G20, Global South, as the primary focus of this summit.
Right. So we're hearing that another 5 to 10 minutes is when the Prime Minister could arrive here. But let me get you a conversation as we keep getting you these visuals, and as we await updates from the Prime Minister's office. Let's also play out a conversation that my colleague, and I'll request our guest to stay with us. Let me just play our interview with the Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs. My colleague Sapna Das had spoken to him earlier today about the economic deliverables. Let's play that out for our viewers, and then we can return to our guests.
A lot is being asked on the crypto assets roadmap and the road forward. You explain time and again in detail, read this, read that. But can you summarize it for us that what is the outcome takeaway from the G20 Leaders Summit and what is the road forward?
Okay. Number one, among the G20 membership, the work done by IMF, FSB, FATF and BIS, a very clear and comprehensive understanding of policy framework for assessment of risk that has been established on the crypto assets. The second one is an earlier work which was done, which also has been endorsed by the ministers, that when it comes to the stable coins as well as the unbacked crypto assets, what kind of regulations, what are the high level principles to be done for regulations and oversight and supervision of that asset class. There has been an endorsement. Third element, that given the risk, and it has a clear recognition that the risk can be higher for emerging economies, what are the building blocks for a good set of regulations? And who has to do it, what kind of a tentative time frame, and what those building blocks are. On all three matters, there has been a clear understanding has been reached. Now the further work, those agencies working with different jurisdictions, they will be taking it forward, and of course the jurisdictional authorities, each country will also be taking a call on that.
So that's from the G20 perspective. Where does India stand here now, and what is it for us going forward in terms of our own regulations, non-regulations on crypto assets?
Based on the consensus which we have been in a position to, which we have been able to achieve or rather build, there we will be considering those recommendations very carefully and decide our own policies and thereafter take further action.
Okay. RBI had advocated for a ban long ago. That's not the case anymore. Is that what we understand? I mean, just not talking about the central bank alone, but that was one of the areas that is no longer on the table now. It's regulation that we're talking about, a global norms.
You are asking a leading question on this one. This is not to be seen in that binary. It is a framework for assessing risk has been put together. What will be a sound policies? So keeping that framework in mind, now we'll have to analyze our own position with the reference to what globally the leaders have agreed that they will travel it together. So if given those, what should be our position will be decided in the coming months.
So one last question. The declaration also talks about the downside risks to global growth as of now. The impact of various conflicts and all of that. Talks about how central banks still need to work together. Our fiscal and monetary policies need to be in sync. Would you tell us something about that, and what does this really mean going forward? Because a lot of steps, India per se also has been taken, and we have been seeing a lot of action unfolding over the last 1.5 odd years. What is the road forward? What does this speak about growth? What is our assessment on that?
See, as far as global growth is concerned, there are two elements which are in the play. For in several economies, inflation continues to be very high. So those central banks have been talking about that they have to further tighten the monetary policy, increase the policy rates, and that will play it out, and it will have an impact on growth in those economies. That's one. Second, there has been the global trade has also been at a low key, and the kind of a high growth rate which was being seen is no longer being visible in the near future. Where does it impact India? On the good side, a lower global trade does impact us. But at the same time, Indian services, export of Indian services has been doing extremely well. So it would have, saying that it will have some impact, but we hope that it will be a limited impact.
Right, and the Delhi Declaration also highlighted its commitment on reducing the gender gap between men and women's labour force participation by 25% by 2025. I spoke to Richard Salmons, International Labour Organization's G20 Sherpa, about their recommendations to the G20 and their satisfaction levels with the communique.
There are some significant outcomes in relation to the agreement on a set of policy priorities for extending social protection to gig and platform economy workers, which who in many countries are not covered well by social security systems. And so an agreement around a set of, you might call it a policy roadmap, a series of actions that countries can pick and choose from, but with an agreed aligned purpose to make sure that those workers, even if they're not formal salaried employees, nonetheless are covered by basic Social Security protections or more, is a good step forward.
Right.
Secondly, on gender, there was a explicit review of how countries are doing on the so-called Brisbane goal that was set by the G20 about 8 or 9 years ago to improve women's participation in the labor force by 25% by the year 2025, and they reauthorized our mandate, the ILO's mandate, along with the OECD, to monitor and report on country progress in this regard.
Now, when we look at the Indian economy, any recommendations you have specifically to the workforce in India, labor issues in India that you'd like to highlight?
We do have an active, supportive relationship here with your government and with the involvement of workers and employers organizations. We provide a range of technical assistance in several respects. So we provide that advice based on analysis and evidence, if you will. And I would simply say that in this regard, that one of the most impressive ways the Indian government projected the Indian development experience to the rest of the world, to the rest of the G20, was by highlighting the strides forward that have been made with the digital public infrastructure here. And that has implications for the world of work, for the work that we do, in that it makes it more feasible to reach more workers with, for example, Social Security, social protection benefits, if you will. So one of the recommendations we make to lots of governments, which are still in the process of extending and deepening the coverage of various benefits, applies here as well. India has some ways to go, but it's enabling that progress with technology in ways that are quite impressive. And I think we would just salute the leadership of the government here in putting this on the agenda as an important priority this year.
Right, so that was the ILO. We have been hearing from a lot of foreign leaders who've spoken to their foreign press. Many of them have left the country now. President Biden left in the morning. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, Rishi Sunak and his wife Akshata Murthy, they've all departed, but the Prime Minister is still having those bilaterals. There are at least 15 bilaterals that the Prime Minister has had. Let me also get you a conversation that we had with the Financial Stability Board, their Secretary General, on the cryptocurrency framework they came up with, the risk to global stability that they see right now, and what are some of the key recommendations for India as well. Take a look at that conversation.
We have needed for a long time clarity in the crypto space. You know, how are we going to handle this? How are we going to regulate this? So I think with the endorsement of the leaders today of the crypto framework outlined by the FSB and also the work done by the IMF and others, we now have clarity on that sort of first step. We have to continue to work. We have to implement this globally, and we have to keep monitoring this as this ecosystem changes all the time. But this is a big step to get the leaders' endorsement of the framework.
Right. If I were to ask you about the Financial Stability Board's recommendations on how to regulate crypto assets and stablecoins across jurisdictions, sharing information, the kind of accountability there needs to be for crypto exchanges and crypto assets, give us a sense of what's missing. What are the legal gaps that are missing in the system which need to be plugged urgently?
Right. I think if you think about any financial institution, you're going to expect certain things to be in place. You're going to expect them to have a framework for how they govern themselves. You're going to have an expectation that they understand that they have certain risks and they need to manage them in a certain way. And you're also going to have expectations about how transparent about what they are, what they hold, what they do. And up till now, there was a lack of that certainty in the crypto space. So these recommendations are high-level recommendations. If you look at them, they'll probably make a lot of common sense to you and I, and we'd say, why weren't they there in the first place? But this puts them there in place, formally endorsed by the G20. So this is a big step, and it fills the gap in terms of just the basics that were needed for crypto assets.
So if I were to ask you about some of the basics, you also said in that report that FATF recommendations on money laundering, on must be implemented with reference to crypto assets and stable coins. There should be penalties, and countries should not shy away from imposing penalties on crypto exchanges and crypto assets in case they do not divulge important information. Could you give us a sense of the importance of some of those recommendations?
Right. Well, just think about, first, you mentioned FATF, and one of the big successes of the Indian G20 presidency was that they didn't bring in just our perspective from the Financial Stability Board. They also brought in the IMF to give a macroeconomic, macro-financial. They brought in the FATF. So this is a comprehensive framework. And the importance of having that is if you have gaps in any particular piece, whether it's gaps globally or gaps in different jurisdictions, the key players are going to find those gaps. They're going to move and situate themselves where they can take advantage of those gaps. So just having this comprehensive framework, bringing in the FATF, which is an aspect that could have been forgotten, but the G20 presidency brought them in to bring this comprehensiveness. So we now have some clarity, and it seems to be comprehensive, hopefully.
Right. A lot of countries have even thought about a blanket ban on crypto assets and stable coins. What is your view? Should we have a blanket ban, or we should regulate them and use the innovation to our advantage?
Right. So a couple of thoughts. I mean, the framework that we have outlined does not prevent somebody from banning it. If you look at the risks and you say, in our jurisdiction, what's best would be a ban. That's still within the framework. There are some countries who have tried to ban it, and we've actually seen activity in crypto assets increase after their bans, because you're talking about an instrument here that was created outside of the traditional financial system. It's hard to get at in the traditional ways. So could it work? Possibly. But there are potential benefits here. People have a demand for this. So let's regulate it. Let's put in the comprehensive regulatory framework we have for other parts of the financial system so that people who want to use it can use it in a way that doesn't have repercussions for the financial system.
All right, let me now go across to Mukesh Aghi. Mr. Aghi, thank you for waiting patiently. What do you think India has achieved with this presidency? A lot of what has happened at this G20, it remains to be seen whether it's implemented. But we decided to brand India as much as possible. You've got a cultural pavilion here. You've got a craft exhibition. The India stack has been displayed as well. So India really wanted to showcase the opportunities that we have here, opportunities to invest, set up shop in digital public infrastructure. So how do you think this will augur for India's image in the United States and abroad?
Well, this was the homecoming for India, a nation which is rising economically and geopolitically, a nation which is going to be a great power one day. And what we are seeing is a effort diplomatically to get 20 divergent countries in a fractured world to come together and issue a statement. The way G20 Summit was basically spread out into different part of India, it was very inclusive. It was not just kept within the BJP government states, but all across India. So you saw almost 300 different meetings taking place. So it was a very inclusive summit. And more important, I felt that what we have seen is that India can deliver in a very complex environment some of the deliverables which were expected of that. But I would say that from an economic perspective, what we saw, the announcement of IMAC, that's very critical because it provides an opportunity not only just for India, but to Middle East and Europe and United States to partner together on large infrastructure projects itself. They talked about women empowerment, inclusiveness, especially in the financial sector. That is a critical issue because what we are seeing last 20 years, women engagement in formal workforce seems to be declining. And I think it's important we bring that to the forefront and start working on that. We talked about crypto. We talked about climate financing, biofuel alliances itself. So we have what I call is a vision statements and objective set. Now we need to go execute on all of them, be it on a private basis or on a public basis or public-private partnership itself. So I think it is a tremendous success story for India, especially I have to commend the leadership in India itself from delivering on in a very fractured world. So congratulations on that.
Right. Thank you very much, Mukesh Aghi, for joining us. on a very important occasion, the culmination of India's presidency, and the good news that the Delhi Declaration was approved. Let's also get you an excerpt from the conversation that our colleague Palki Sharma had with Lula da Silva of Brazil. He was here. Remember, Brazil is now going to be taking over the presidency of the G20. Let's listen into that conversation.
Extraordinary, the India agenda that they developed and the promotion of 60 debates or more in different cities. In Brazil, many ministers came to these meetings. We had the health minister, we had the mines and energy minister from Brazil, we had the science and technology minister, the enormous amount, the labor minister came here, and the finance minister came to these meetings. So these hundreds of meetings that you involving thousands of people is a new way that India is teaching to us that it's not sufficient for the presidents of the countries to participate. It's necessary for us to involve the government as a whole, and that we should involve the people that should participate in the debate. We learned a lot, and since we're going to host next year the G20 in Brazil, we will take from India many teachings, and so that we can have a G20 meeting as productive as we had here in India.
One of the big headlines today is the Delhi Declaration. We understand that there is finally consensus. We've seen the draft of the declaration and all leaders have agreed. There was a fear that the war in Ukraine might hijack the agenda. And in the statements that followed since, it was said that Brazil, South Africa and Indonesia helped forge consensus. Can you tell us a little more about the conversation that went in and how did Brazil contribute?
Well, the G20 is a forum that was built because of the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis. From there onwards, the G20 started to discuss many economic issues, and the Bretton Woods institutions were also started to be discussed, the World Bank, the IMF, in an attempt to try to improve the functioning of these multilateral institute. That's why we didn't want here in India, we would discuss the war between Ukraine and Russia. This is not the appropriate forum for that. On the 19th of September of this month, we will have the General Assembly of the UN, and that's the place for us to discuss the war. That's the place for us to try to discuss peace. That's the place for us to call Putin and Zelensky in a negotiation table, and because no one wants war. Everybody is against war. We want peace. So it's necessary for us to establish a conversation policy so that we can try to convince the two presidents from Russia and Ukraine that the war is not the solution for anything, and that the dialogue, the diplomacy, and a table of dialogue could help much more. From the beginning, Brazil has been saying that we do not want to participate in the war efforts. Brazil wants to participate in the peace effort. We want to try to negotiate, as also India thinks like that, China thinks like that, many other countries think like Brazil, and so that's why we believe that it's very important so that the war issue should not be included in the document, in the declaration from the G20. That's very important. Otherwise, people will go to war and then we lose and waste time. Instead of discussing the problems that involve 9 billion inhabitants, the hunger that is affecting 735 million people, unemployment of millions of people, and we stay here discussing something that is not our top priority. And so I believe that it was very important, the decision that was made not to allow that the war would come into our declaration.
All right, so that's a wrap of our special broadcast from the International Media Center here at the Bharat Mandapam. On that note, we're taking a short break, but don't go anywhere. Our live coverage continues on the other side.